We'll now discuss how we can create and use pivot tables. A pivot table is used to quickly summarize large amounts of data. So it's a little different than a normal table because it's a bit more dynamic. We can arrange what our columns are, we can arrange what our rows are, we can actually compute different types of aggregate functions such as the sum or the average. So it's a lot more dynamic in that we can kind of change elements of the table as we see fit. And with this data, we can actually even create what are called pivot charts. So these would be graphical representations of the data in the pivot table. And everything that we've talked about with charts would also apply to pivot charts. Now, to create a pivot table, it's worth noting that at least one of the columns of the data set must have duplicate values. And this is because the way that pivot tables work is that we can actually group up some of these values. So like if you have a column of names, for example, and maybe we have duplicate names, maybe different like transactions as an example. We can actually group up all of the other values so that each row in the pivot table would correspond to one of these names. If we don't have duplicate values, then our pivot table isn't really going to look any different from our normal table. And then another column must have numeric values because we're going to group up these names or whatever the data for this column is by like the sum of something, the average of something, the min, the max, and so forth. So we have to have at least one column that has some numbers so we can actually do this grouping up. We would then select the cells in the range that we want to create our pivot table from, and then we would select the pivot table option in the tables group of the insert tab. We'll go over an example in just a bit, but you go to the insert tab, and then on the left side there's a tables group, and you would select pivot table. So then you just choose the data that you're going to analyze, and then choose the location of the pivot table. So do you want it in the already existing spreadsheet, or you can actually put it into a new spreadsheet. And then once you have your pivot table, you have several options as far as modifying it and changing the layout and so forth. So we can use the pivot table field list window in order to add fields into the pivot table. So when we create this pivot table, the data that we have in there will be considered as fields of the pivot table. So we can choose which fields we want to show in the pivot table and which fields we do not want to show. We can also do sorting and filtering. That way we can make it easier to analyze specific subsets of data. Now by default, the values area would represent the subtotals. So this means that we could summarize by other options such as the average or the min or the max. And then whenever we make changes to the source data, because maybe that data changes, if we want to update the values associated with it, we can actually select refresh in the options tab. So maybe like we realized there was an error in the original data. So we can go back to the spreadsheet, make some changes to the data, and then go back to the pivot table. At first it looks like it didn't update, but if you select this refresh option in the options tab, then it would automatically update the pivot table with the new data in the corresponding spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and walk through an example of just creating a pivot table. Now this is going to be a very bare bones example, but it should at least give you an idea of what to expect. So we're going to create some headers for our data first because we need some data. I'm going to call one column, row, and then number. You'll see why in just a second. And we already mentioned that one of the columns has, at least one of them has to have duplicate values. So we can do something like header 1, header 2, and header 3. And I'm going to have some duplicate values for rows. And then we're going to have some numbers. Alright, so to create the pivot table, we need to go to the Insert tab, and then we just click on Pivot Table. It's going to ask us to select our range. That's already been taken care of for us. In fact, everything here looks good, except I'm going to change the location of the worksheet or the pivot table. Let's put it right about here. Yeah, we'll just put it in the same spreadsheet. That way, at least we can kind of see what's going on. So I'm going to click on OK. Here's our pivot table, and we see we get an Analyze and a Design tab for it. There isn't really too much here we're going to worry about for now, and if we see here, our pivot table doesn't really have much. The important part is over here. So we have these fields, which just happen to be the columns of our data,
And what we can do is we can select what fields we want to show in the pivot table, and then we can drag them to these different areas, which will decide the layout of the table. So I want all three of these, column, row, and number. So I'm going to click those, and no, that shows up some stuff here, but it looks kind of odd. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the column part be under the columns quadrant, and the row is going to be in the rows quadrant. So this looks a little bit better. So I mean, we have our headers, we have our rows, we have some numbers, and we have some totals. So in a pivot table, by default, the last column and the last row will give the sum of every column and every row. Now we can change that. I can just right click and I can go to summarize values by, and I can change it to count. I can change it to average. So we can make some changes to this if we want to. So maybe we'll leave it as average. So now we're going to get the average of every row and column. I can even swap stuff around. Maybe I want the columns to be under the rows, and I want the rows to be the columns. So we can change how we view our data that way. I'll change it back. So we can do all sorts of stuff with this. I mean, we even have little boxes here so we can sort and we can filter. So we can do that for the column labels. We can do that for the row labels. So we can do all that. We can even create a chart based on this data. So under the Analyze tab, we have Pivot Chart. So I can choose a column chart. So maybe we'll do that. And then we have all the options with as we had with our normal chart, except now we have some stuff we can analyze. So here we can choose the fields that we want. Maybe we'll just leave it as is. So we have our legend series is going to be the columns in this case, and then we have row values for each of these. So I can, if I want to, I can put it in a different chart or a different sheet. So we can do that. So there's our pivot chart. And what's also nice about this is if I change some stuff here, so maybe I'll change this to an 8 and change this to a 9. Notice it doesn't update the pivot table right away, but under the Analyze tab, if I go to refresh, now it does update, and if I take a look at my chart, it changes the data there. So it's a very dynamic approach for displaying our data.